Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, as we all know, art history is to a great extent founded on the history of styles, and this dates back at least to Johann Winckelmann and his History of the Art of Antiquity, which was published in Dresden in 1764, and in which Winckelmann divided ancient Greek art into various stylistic periods. This specific approach of art focuses a lot on the idea of purity. It focuses a lot on the idea of stylistic purity. Each style is supposed to have its own essence, which fundamentally defines it and which stands for its ontological purity. Moreover, the history of styles tends to make extensive use of the rhetorical device of opposition, and that has proven to be very efficient. Heinrich Wölfflin, for instance, set, as we all know, Baroque against classicism and defined that opposition through a set of antagonist terms in kunstgeschichtliche Grundbegriffe, das Problem der Stilentwicklung in der neueren Kunst, Principles of Art History, the problem of the development of style in early modern art in English. In that very influential study, Wölfflin formulated 5 pairs of opposed terms, which were supposed to reflect the artistic shift between the 16th and the 17th centuries. Thus, Wölfflin opposed linear to painterly, plain to recession, close to open form, multiplicity to unity, absolute clarity to relative clarity. We do not need to go into any further detail about these opposed terms, as they are not central to my lecture. But we might keep in mind that art history tends to oppose things, that art history tends to set up categories that are mutually exclusive. This all has led to the shaping of a most interesting historiographical construction. This construction, however, has also proven to be, in many ways, a rather artificial and rhetorically biased one. As a matter of fact, we tend today to make less extensive use of these stylistic categories than we did just a few decades ago. Many art historians today tend to view the history of styles as a little outdated, I would say. The history of styles seems a little simplistic, and the grounds on which it is founded seems a little too loose. Yet, if we tend not to use these categories as much as we did, we are still very much subject to them. Indeed, the underlying logic of the history of styles is still very much present and is very difficult to get rid of. Basically because the history of styles is, as I said, what art history stands on. So, even if we tend more and more to be a little suspicious towards terms like Baroque, Rococo, or Neoclassicism, we still often think of art in terms of the periods and the borders established by the history of styles. As a matter of fact, it structures our understanding of art and it determines the way in which we see art. I myself have always been fascinated by the history of styles and the way in which it divides the history of art into periods. I've always been intrigued by the capacity of abstraction that it takes to establish such a system. And I've always been wanting to know what lies behind it. To initiate a process of reflection on the history of 18th century styles, I organized a conference last year in Lausanne on the historiography of the Rococo, and hopefully a selection of the papers presented at that conference will be published next year in the Zeitschrift für Kunstgeschichte. More recently, I have been part of the organizing committee of an exhibition at the Fondation Custodia in Paris, displaying a selection of 150 drawings from the collections of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The exhibition opened just a few weeks ago. The drawings on display all date back to the second part of the 18th century, and the purpose of the exhibition is to discuss the evolution of art in France at that time. The title of the exhibition hints at this. Emmanuel Brugerolles, the chief curator of the exhibition, chose to call it, slightly ironically, De l'alcôve aux barricades, playing with the idea of an evolution of French art from the Rococo feminine delights of the alcove to the more neoclassical virile virtues of revolution. I personally was entrusted with the ornament drawings, and I chose to organize my section as a reflection on how these drawings have been presented in the historiography of 18th century French art. So in my lecture today, I'll discuss some of the results of these two projects. I will, for instance, show you a few drawings currently on display at the Fondation Custodia in Paris. The historiography of 18th century French art turns on the opposition between Rococo and Neoclassicism. We know that. We all know that. This conceptual framework is at the root of how we perceive 18th century French art. And not only French art, of course, more generally 18th century European art. I've chosen to focus on French art because, well, it is my area of specialization, but also because what happened within the artistic field in 18th century France has been so very important for the shaping of the stylistic framework I've questioned. Indeed, I assume that the conceptual framework, this conceptual framework has arisen in a distorted interpretation of the critical discourses regarding the arts that emerged in France around 1750. These discourses were from time to time very violent. They targeted the so-called bad taste of contemporary French painting and interior decoration, and these discourses ultimately aimed at artistic regeneration. Most of the works produced by painters and decorators at the time were felt not to be good enough, even to be really bad. That's why so many amateurs and self-styled defenders of good taste demanded change, and some demanded radical change even. The writings, for instance, of the abbé Leblanc, Charles-Nicolas Cochin, Étienne Font de Saint-Yenne, Denis Diderot, but also the writings of Winckelmann, of course, these have been used, often in a misconstruing way, to shape the stylistic framework I've been talking about, opposing Rococo and to Neoclassicism. These writings have been used to define categories that rely upon a specious dichotomy, setting superficiality against depth, whimsicality against rationality, and femininity against virility. Categories like the Rococo and the Neoclassical are clearly founded on such opposed terms. My lecture today will be divided into three parts. First, I'll mention and quote some of the main 18th century authors known for their critical standpoints. I'll try to identify the works of art they are directing their criticism against. Then I'll show that a closer reading of 18th century sources reveals an overall much more complex and nuanced situation. Indeed, if some of the defenders of good taste were actually advocating for a radical change in art, most of them were rather in favor of a compromise. But their discourses have not, by far, been as much acknowledged by the history of styles as the more radical ones, as the history of styles tends to be more inclined to listen to extreme opinions, as it tends to found its discourses on opposition. This then will finally lead me to highlight the impact of these historiographical misreadings on the status of objects produced during the second half of the 18th century. Most of these are regarded as not pure enough, often as too pretty, too exotic, too hybrid, or even rococo in character, to be affiliated with quote-unquote true neoclassicism. Hence, these objects somewhat fall outside the categories of both the neoclassicism and the Rococo, and they somewhat end up being excluded from art history, or at least they end up playing a secondary role within it. As I suggested before, the abbé Leblanc is an important figure, and his name is very often mentioned in the historiography of 18th century French art. He is described as a strong critique of the bad taste of French artists of the time, especially in regard of interior decoration. So I'll read English translations of passages from authors I quote, but you will always find the French original version beneath the English version, which of course, I'm afraid, overcrowd my slides a little. So here is a passage from a text published by the Abbé Leblanc in the 1740s. I quote, "They," and he is referring to the decorators of the time, "they no longer observe any order, any probability in their productions. They heap cornices, bases, columns, cascades, rushes, and rocks in a confused manner, one upon another, and in some corner of this chaos they will place a cupid in a great fright, and have a festoon of flowers above the whole. And this is what they call designs of a new taste. Thus, by going beyond the due limits, we are returned to the Gothic barbarity." Well, this is certainly a rather amusing text, but what kind of objects could Leblanc be referring to? It seems quite obvious that he might have had in mind interiors like those produced by the Pinot workshop in the 1730s, 1740s, 1750s. Here you have an example of the Pinot's decorative schemes. This Grand Salon was produced at the beginning of the 1750s for the Château d'Asnières outside Paris, and was subsequently re-erected at Cliveden House in Berkshire. The walls are covered with wooden panels, richly carved wooden panels, and the upper part here, the upper part of these panels tend to blend with the plaster corniche in a rather densely mixture of twisted and broken mouldings and various sorts of ornaments, trophies, scrolls, human figures, animals, and festoons of flowers, heaped together, Leblanc might have said, in a rather fanciful way. This composition could therefore hardly be said to be Vitruvian in its spirit. As a matter of fact, it breaks all possible Vitruvian laws and rules. Vitruvius stated that the parts of an architectural ensemble should be clearly defined, individualized, and be well proportioned one to another and to the whole. In the Salon of the Château d'Asnières, it would be difficult to establish in any precise way where each ornament starts and where it ends. Moreover, the various ornaments are so many and so small and so shredded that they can hardly be said to be proportioned to the whole, at least not in a way that would have been deemed correct by the defenders of good taste. Indeed, if you want an architectural ensemble to be easy to read, to be easy to take in, you should not divide its parts into too small units, and you should not shape these units in too many different ways. This is what architectural theory keeps repeating ever since the antique treatise of Vitruvius was, quote-unquote, rediscovered in the Renaissance. One could therefore say that the Salon of the Château d'Asnières does not subject to rules that at that time in the 18th century were viewed by many, and certainly by Leblanc, as universal and eternal rules. The defenders of good taste would certainly have disliked it and would have blamed not only the Pinot but also the commissioner, the Marquis de Boyer, for their bad taste. The defenders of good taste might very well have said that it was barbarian and Gothic, as Gothic at the time was a term used to describe objects that were felt to be overcrowded with ornaments, as were, in the opinion of the defenders of good taste, some buildings dating back to what we could call the late Middle Ages, like, for instance, the Cathedral of Strasbourg. Its facades certainly show a rather dense embroidery of stone elements. Some others might, for their part, have said that the Salon of the Château d'Asnières was Arabic in its spirit, as so-called overcrowded architectural ensembles often were linked at that time to Arabic architecture, which was felt to belong to the same unruly type. If we consider this interior at the Alhambra, we might understand why the defenders of good taste connected Arabic architecture with French decorative schemes of the time. Both types indeed show rather dense decorative compositions, albeit of course very different in many ways. Let me quote another of these critical French authors of the mid-18th century. One of the most famous is Charles Nicolas Cochin, and one of his most famous texts is an article published in the Mercure de France in 1754, which was a very widely read journal at the time. In his petition to the goldsmiths, chasers, carvers of wood for the apartments and others, in that article, Cochin set reason, simple rules, good sense, and sound principles against fancy and whimsicality. He blamed artists, workmen, and architects of the time for not being sensible. For instance, he addressed goldsmiths in the following way, I quote, "We should be infinitely obliged to them if they would be good enough not to alter the intention of things, and to remember, for instance, that a candlestick ought to be straight and perpendicular in order to support its light, not twisted as if someone had forced it out of shape. That its pan ought to be concave so as to hold the wax that runs down, and not convex so as to let it drop in a sheet on the candlestick." Rather famous passage of his petition. Let's have a look at a candelabra designed by Just-Aurel Meissonnier, an object which seems to perfectly well fit the description of Cochin, that is to say, to perfectly well fit what the author disliked and rejected in his ironic article. The object was cast in silver in the 1730s. The stem is all twisted, and so are the arms. The arms, which are shaped as stylized foliage. The pans, for their part, that is to say, the devices that should normally act as wax holders, these are not concave, but fancifully formed so that they cannot hold the wax that runs down from the candle. Étienne Font de Saint-Yenne is yet another of these critical authors often mentioned in the historiography of 18th century French art. Font de Saint-Yenne blamed his fellow countrymen for their bad taste and for their craze for mirrors. Indeed, mirrors, he thought, had replaced more ambitious and intellectually satisfying history paintings in the interiors of the time. This passage here, from a most influential text published in 1746, is very often quoted. "The science of the brush has been forced to yield to pressure from glass and its brilliance. The easy mechanical perfection of mirrors and their abundance have exiled from our apartment the most beautiful of all arts, to which one has granted asylum in miserable small spaces to fill, over doors, the upper parts of mantelpieces, and pier glasses shortened only to save money." End of quote. Font de Saint-Yenne referred in general terms to interiors like the oval salon of the Princesse de Soubise, decorated in the 1730s after drawings by the architect Germain Boffrand. In the spandrels, on the top of the panels, Charles-Joseph Natoire painted scenes from the story of Cupid and Psyche. But the painter had to squeeze these scenes into fancifully formed frames between the arches and the curvy corniche, whereas the mirrors, as you can see, occupy a prominent place within the overall decorative scheme. Hence, Font de Saint-Yenne would certainly have argued that the noble art of painting had been ousted here by a mere luxurious device. The defenders of good taste did, however, not only target the undignified space reserved for painting, they also targeted painting itself. Indeed, some thought that painting itself had been largely debased. It had lost, according to them, its seriousness and had become a mere servant of bad taste, to express it mildly. The painter who by far crystallized the most negative comments in the second part of the 18th century was, of course, François Boucher. Boucher actually often became synonymous in art criticism at the time with bad taste. However successful he proved to be among potential commissioners, or perhaps precisely because he was so successful, he was dismissed as the enemy of good painting. Denis Diderot, the famous French writer of the 18th century, Denis Diderot was one of the most vehement detractors of the painter. Diderot was convinced that the main purpose of painting was to elevate the mind, through references to sacred and profane history, or to mythology, or at least to worthy sentiment. But even if Boucher did paint scenes inspired by sacred and profane history, and was famous for his mythological compositions, he treated these subjects in a way that did not please the defenders of good taste, and especially Diderot, who never ceased complaining about his art. Let's read one of his statements dating from 1761. I quote, "His elegance, his affected winsomeness, his novelistic gallantry, his coquetry, his taste, his facility, variety, brilliancy, his made-up complexions, his debauchery, necessarily captivate fops, little women, young men, society people, the crowd of those who are strangers to real taste, to the truth, to just ideas, and to the seriousness of art. How could they resist the ostentation, the libertinage, the brilliancy, the pompons, the bosoms and bottoms, Boucher's licentious epigrams?" End of quote. How very flattering. Let's have a look at one of Boucher's mythological compositions, and let's analyze why. Let's have a look at one of Boucher's mythological compositions, and let's analyze why these bothered Diderot so much. Here we have a depiction of the setting of the sun, a painting commissioned by the Marquise de Pompadour to be executed as a tapestry for her Château de Bellevue at the beginning of the 1750s. The sun is, of course, represented by Apollo here on the left. Apollo, after his daily work, is welcomed by Thetis here on the right and her marine entourage. This painting certainly belongs to what has been called gallant mythology. The gestures of the various figures are affected and elegant and refined, and could by all means be felt as rather unnatural and maybe even unworthy of the gods and goddesses of Greco-Roman mythology. It is also true that certain parts of the female anatomies are very much highlighted for reasons which might not be only artistic. The figure of Apollo, on his part, could be said to be a little too boyish and not virile enough to represent one of the major gods of the Greco-Roman pantheon. Moreover, the complexions are a little white and pinkish, as were they made up with powder and rouge. Finally, the chiaroscuro effects can be said to be a little unnatural too and inconsistent. The lights and the shades are indeed distributed more to make the painting look glossy than to achieve a truthful imitation of nature. Hence, as Diderot so often concluded, Boucher must have painted mainly for fops and for little women, that is to say, in his opinion, for people devoid of good taste and who only praised artificial values. I could obviously go on, listing numerous other authors and texts saying approximately the same thing. But that won't be necessary, I believe, as we all by now have understood that the boundaries of the Rococo have been established on the basis of these critical texts. Art history, as it has been constructed since the 19th century, has relied on these texts to shape the contours of the Rococo as an aesthetic category. The various objects described in these texts have been used to characterize the Rococo as a style. The Neoclassicism, on the other hand, has been defined as the very opposite of what the critical authors described in their texts. A work of art, in principle, can only belong to the category of Neoclassicism if it does convey ideas like edle Einfalt und stille Größe, noble simplicity and quiet grandeur, to quote Winckelmann, an author who, of course, has been extensively used to shape Neoclassicism as a style. So this is basically how the history of 18th century styles has been established. The critical texts published from around 1750 in France are at the root of our binary perception of the century. Jacques Louis David is probably the painter who is the most often mentioned in the historiography of Neoclassicism. David is described as a major representative of the style, even as its representative par excellence. At the beginning of his career, however, he painted very much in the manner of Boucher, as we can see in this portrait of a famous Parisian actress of the time, Mademoiselle Guimard, here represented as Terpsichore, the muse of dance. But David did also listen very carefully and attentively to the critical voices that had arisen from about 1750, and he actually adapted his painting according to these. That's why a work like The Oath of the Herati fits so very well to the ideas on which Neoclassicism is founded. This painting was designed by David with these ideas in mind. The painting is a free adaptation of a story told by Livy. Rome, in very primitive times, happened to be in conflict with the neighboring city of Alba. Instead of the two cities sending their armies to war, they agreed to choose 3 men from each city to engage in single combat. The victor in that fight would be the victorious city. From Rome, 3 brothers, the Herati, agreed to end the war by fighting 3 brothers from the family of Alba, the Curati. David depicted here the Herati brothers on the left here, saluting their father in the middle of the composition, the father who holds their swords out for them, while the female representatives of the family to the right contemplate the spectre of death. This painting certainly stresses the importance of patriotism and virile self-sacrifice, often perceived as noble values, but it also shows a most rational composition. The space is clearly defined by architectural devices. The various figures are clearly outlined, and apart from the father who stands alone in the middle, the figures are grouped together on the left and on the right. Thus we have 2 groups and 1 single figure standing in between them, corresponding to the 3 arched openings here in the background. It is a most rational composition. It is very different, of course, extremely different even in its spirit from the composition by Boucher. That's why these 2 painters, Boucher and David, have become synonymous with the Rococo and Neoclassicism, respectively. If we consider the second half of the 18th century and even the latter decades of that century, we'll, however, notice that paintings like The Oath of the Herati are rather rare, and that they are rarely at the time described as the only way to restore the true dignity of painting. An article commenting on The Oath of the Herati in the Mercure de France in 1785 hints at this. I quote, "No doubt, this painting, which is so generally and justly admired, is now inspiring a great number of young art painters to take M. David as a model. It is relevant, therefore, to point out that the severity of style and extreme expression on view there are very particular virtues, appropriate to the subject, the abuse of which would be extremely dangerous." End of quote. The author of these lines, who remains unknown to us, actually highlights that the radical way in which the Oath of the Herati is painted would not suit other subjects, and that there is a danger that painters wanting to imitate David would make inappropriate use of his specific manner. What is stated here is, in fact, that the radical manner developed by David is not the only possible reference. As a matter of fact, most defenders of good taste in 18th century France, most of them were less extreme in their opinions than we might think today. And a careful reading of their texts indeed allows us to paint a rather nuanced picture of the artistic theory and practice in the second part of the 18th century. Jacques-François Blondel, for instance, the famous 18th century theorist of architecture, he proves to be a perfect example of this more compromising attitude. In his Observations générales sur la décoration intérieure, published in 1762, Blondel commented on interior decoration in the second part of the 18th century. I quote, "The masculine style which the majority of our architects strive nowadays to give to our ornaments has yet, in their view, not necessitated that character of heaviness which our ancestors affected in their interiors, nor that prodigality of small members for which we have criticized the majority of our woodworkers, but rather a just medium between these two excesses. They came at last to feel that interior decorations ought to be pleasing." End of quote. Most defenders of good taste did agree with Blondel. Hence, most of them would also have agreed with the words of the Marquis de Marigny, who was the director of the Bâtiment du Roi, when he said, I quote, "I do not want any of those modern chicory leaves, nor do I want any of that classical austerity. I seek a happy medium." End of quote. This clearly shows that things were obviously much more complicated than what the history of styles has mapped out. It also stresses that the history of styles often disregards historical evidence. Here, for instance, the very important notion of convenance, that is to say, appropriateness. That notion was very important in the 18th century and conditioned much of the shaping of forms. Appropriateness implied that artistic forms should be subject to social uses. And appropriateness, as Blondel and Marigny stated it, condemned austerity as much as whimsicality, that is to say, extravagance in all its forms. Appropriateness implied compromise, but compromise is nothing the history of styles is very keen on, for compromise fits in rather badly with the idea of purity. Therefore, the more nuanced discourses were not by far as much acknowledged as the more radical ones when it came to outline the stylistic history of the 18th century. So our view of the 18th century has therefore been very much founded on the more radical writings of the time. And hence, a whole segment, actually most objects produced in the second part of the 18th century, do somewhat, as I said, fall outside the categories of both the Rococo and the Neoclassicism. That is true of the paintings, but even more of the objets de décoration, the decorative objects, as we shall see. The Rococo, on the one hand, has often been described as impure. This means the stylistic purity of the Rococo is in many ways characterized by some kind of fundamental impurity. The Neoclassicism, on the other hand, is supposed to be fundamentally the opposite. That is to say, it's supposed to be freed from all superfluous ornamental additions and all that is not felt to be noble enough. That specificity makes entry to that category very difficult, as most objects, as I suggested in my introductions, are regarded as not pure enough to be affiliated with it. Apart from some paintings by Jacques Didier, there is not much that can unproblematically be linked to that category. So, in his book on the early neoclassicism in France, Sven Eriksson claims that many of the objects he describes and analyzes are in fact not, quote-unquote, truly neoclassical. A painter like Joseph-Marie Vien, for instance, holds a central but no less problematic place in the discourse on neoclassicism. As he was Jacques David's master, he is often described as the painter who paved the way for the future achievements of his pupil, that is to say, for the fulfillment of neoclassicism. This view is partly founded on several statements by Diderot. Indeed, Diderot was very complimentary about especially one painting Vien exhibited at the 1767 Paris Salon, that is to say, at the great art event that took place every 2 years in the French capital. Diderot found the composition of Saint-Denis preaching in Gaul well structured and clear and noble. So why then has Vien been defined as a mere, I quote, purveyor of fashionable erotica who had remained fully rococo in feeling while paying lip service to the new classicizing trends of taste? At least that is how Hugh Honor describes him in his most influential book on neoclassicism, published in 1968. Indeed, what Vien depicted in many of his paintings, like in the Marchand d'Amour, the Seller of Cupids, dating from 1763, is not devoid of gallantry and even of debauchery, as we shall see, something Honor, of course, regards as not noble enough and too rococo in its spirit to be neoclassical. Vien drew the subject of his painting directly from a print from Le Antiquità di Herculano Esposte, which was a collection of images of archaeological finds from Herculaneum. It depicts a woman selling cupids, that is to say love, to another woman in the company of her servant. The composition of Vien's painting has been perceived as rather sober and noble, but the subject chosen by the painter closed the doors to neoclassicism, at it definitely seemed a little low, especially the obscene gesture of the cupid the merchant holds by his wings, which is an addition Vien made to the print. Then we have, of course, all the decorative objects produced in the second part of 18th century France. What to do with these? How to classify them? This drawing, which is currently on display at the Fondation Custodia in Paris, this drawing is a project for a tureen by a leading Parisian goldsmith of the time, Robert-Joseph Auguste. Auguste worked, among others, for Catherine the Great, for the King of Sweden, but also for George III. This tureen here might in fact have been a project for George III and might have been intended for the Palace of Herrenhausen near Hanover. In the historiography of goldsmithing, Auguste is often described as the greatest promoter of neoclassicism within his specific field. The various parts here of the objects designed by him can all be easily identified. In this case, there is no doubt to where they start and to where they end. The stand, for instance, the stand here, is clearly separated from the tureen, and the tureen itself has a clearly identified foot, body, and cover. It is, of course, definitely very different from more fancifully designed tureens, like this here on the right by Messonnier. Yet, there always seem to remain some doubts about how neoclassical Auguste really is. The putti, for instance, on the handles, but also the hunting scenes, often found on the top of the covers on works by Auguste. These are often felt not to be sober enough, even to be a little fanciful, and therefore a little rococo in their spirit. Thus, Auguste, in spite of being described as a representative of neoclassicism, tends to be suspected of being a little rococo in his works, which means he tends to be categorized as a transitional figure, as were he torn between two irreconcilable poles. The objects of decorations commissioned by Marie Antoinette in the 1770s and 1780s are also often defined as not, quote-unquote, truly neoclassical. And I'm afraid we don't see these really very well because they are too small, sorry. So, 3 drawings on display at the Fondation Custodia show a project for her cabinet intérieur at Versailles. The Rousseau de la Rotière brothers presented several projects for this little room set in the small appartement of the Queen. These 2 here are thought to be by Jean-Siméon Rousseau de la Rotière, and they show 2 walls, each divided into 3 vertical parts, and all these parts are strictly orthogonally shaped. On the drawing on the left, the door, the overdoor, and the panels are all rectangular, and so are also the mantelpiece and the 2 panels which flank it on the drawing on the right. The colourful motifs, for their part, which were intended to be painted on the panels, these are all framed in a rigorous manner. The mouldings of the frames are straight and not twisted as they were in the Grand Salon of the Château d'Asnières, for instance. Yet this ensemble has been described as a little rococo in its spirit. The spatial inconsistency of the compositions of the panels, for instance, is felt not to be neoclassical, but rather to refer to a rococo interpretation of the grotesques, like that we find in compositions by Christophe Huet, for instance here in the Cabinet des Singes at the Hôtel de Rouen in Paris. These compositions depict scenes involving figures in landscapes floating within ornamental shredded frames. The panels designed by the Rousseau de la Rotière are certainly rather close to those by Huet in terms of spatial inconsistency. You have here ornaments, figures, and stage-like supports, drapé, and so on. All these features blended together in a composition rather inconsistent in spatial terms. Moreover, the playfulness of the compositions is felt to be more rococo than neoclassical. On the right here, you have a dancing woman, you have also a dancing musician, and on the left here you have a putto and a woman on swings. Swings, especially, are always linked to the Rococo, as they embody the lack of stability which we tend to see as a major feature of that style. And of course, in the historiography of 18th century French art, swings are always linked to this famous scene by a painter who has been defined as a major representative of the Rococo, Fragonard, of course. Let's have a look at another decoration commissioned by Marie Antoinette, her boudoir at the Château de Fontainebleau, also designed by the Rousseau brothers and dating from the 1780s. The walls are organized in an orthogonal way. The lines of the composition are clear. There are no overlappings, nothing is shredded. The ornaments are displayed in a grotesque-like way within perfectly rectangular frames, and these can be linked, why not, to the Vatican Loggia designed by Raphael, that is to say, to a very prestigious model. Like in the Vatican Loggia, figures, vegetal elements and geometric forms are assembled on the Fontainebleau panels on a white background. One could even say that the Fontainebleau grotesques are less dense than those at the Vatican, and thus allow an easier reading of the compositions. But the whole thing is too glossy to be neoclassical. The grotesques are set on a silvery background. The furniture, delivered by Jean-Henri Risner, is literally breathtaking with its metallic and mother-of-pearl marquetry. Here you have a picture of the side of a roll-top desk he delivered in 1786. Moreover, the room is dominated by flower motifs, and flower motifs are generally linked to the Rococo. So we have here an ensemble that looks too flowery, too ornate, in a word too pretty to be, quote-unquote, truly neoclassical, as Sven Eriksson might have said. That is why an author like Pierre Verlet, who was a specialist of French 18th century decorative art and who used to be a curator at the Château de Versailles, that's why he categorized these objects as belonging to a specific Marie-Antoinette style, the style Marie-Antoinette. More recently, a curator at Fontainebleau coined another category to define it, a category as pretty as the boudoir itself, the antique fleuri, flowery antique. Not antique in a noble neoclassical way, but in a gender-biased feminine one. In Hugh Honor's view, ensembles like the Cabinet Intérieur and the Boudoir de Marie-Antoinette belong to a hybrid category between Rococo and Neoclassicism, as stated in the following lines. I quote, "These objects, like Vien's paintings, exploited the cult of antiquity for purely decorative ends. They really perpetuate Ancien Régime Rococo taste in antique fancy dress. Attractive byproducts of a hybrid Rococo neoclassicism, they represent a vision of the ancient world only superficially different from that of the earlier 18th century, which was modified but not radically altered by new attitudes." End of quote. Chinoiserie, then, of course, raise the same problems, as Hugh Honor puts it. I quote, "It need hardly to be said the new style, calm, restrained, aloof, and occasionally a little pedantic, was less well adapted to express the vision of Cathay than the Rococo had been. Yet, despite the pontifications of classicists, the Orient continued to exert much of its exotic appeal." End of quote. Quite obviously, chinoiserie did not disappear in the second part of the 18th century, far from it. Dragons were still appreciated, like in this drawing by Jean-Charles de la Fosse, currently on display at the Fondation Custodia. You see here the dragon in the lower part here. De la Fosse hence mixes chinoiserie motifs with elements linked to the Greco-Roman art and architecture, like the fluted frieze, like the rosette, like the cylindrical pedestal and the ovoid urn. Asian porcelain, too, was widely collected and often mounted in gold and bronze in Europe. These two Chinese celadon vases have Parisian mounts dating from about 1770. Chinese and Japanese lacquer screens were still used as well to decorate chests of drawers and many other types of furniture, like here the drop-front secretary delivered by Jean-Henri Risner for the Cabinet Intérieur of Marie-Antoinette at Versailles in 1783. Here, Japanese lacquer panels were integrated in an oak frame veneered with ebony and enriched with a very luxurious bronze decoration made of flowery garlands and displaying the monogram of the Queen, M.A. for Marie-Antoinette here. But the overall outline of these objects tended to straighten themselves out a little. Marie-Antoinette's drop-front secretary is orthogonally shaped and imitates traditional architectural devices like the consoles and the entablators. Therefore, Hugh Honor says that chinoiseries, I quote, of this period were sometimes treated with classical restraint, end of quote. And he adds, having written of Baroque chinoiserie and of Rococo chinoiserie, it would be tempting to describe such objects as examples of neoclassical chinoiserie. It would be tempting, he says, but he also suggests that it would not be quite appropriate. Chinoiserie belong to the exotic, that is to say, to something alien in the broadest sense of the word. Chinoiserie do not connect with the dominant Western artistic features, and thus they convey the idea of impurity. As the Rococo has very much been defined as a fundamentally impure style, it is logically more adapted to incorporate chinoiserie than neoclassicism. Hence, and I will conclude with this, most objects produced in France during the second part of the 18th century are often described in the historiography as mere byproducts of a belated Rococo spirit or as caricatures of truer neoclassicism. These objects are consequently stuck in between two irreconcilable categories which result from an unnuanced view of the 18th century, of the siècle des Lumières. In order to accommodate these problematic objects, various authors classify them in various more or less fanciful categories like the style Marie-Antoinette and the antique fleurie. These substyles, however, far from lessening the already inessential stylistic status of these objects, tend, I believe, actually to stress it. Furthermore, this shows that art history, at least when it comes to analyzing 18th century French art, is rather little inclined to take into account diversity, as it tends to reduce things to binary poles. Thank you so much for your attention.